So goodbye, Yellow Brick Road. We are the dogs of society howl. You can't plant me in your penthouse. I'm going back for my plow. Back to the howling old owl in the woods. Hunting, saying the horny back toad. And oh, I have finally decided my future lies beyond the Yellow Brick Road. In 1985 in Kansas, the Disney film Return to Oz was released in cinemas, and a few years later, it made its way into home VHS. I can't remember how old I was at the time I have seen it, perhaps 5 years old at the most. I knew right away that there was something unusual about the film, something especially disturbing. I remember that first time I've seen it, I cried. I remember watching the film, glued to place me in front of the television, and not out of involvement out of terror. Truth to be told, it's a bloody scary film. Now before you go groan and go read something else, don't worry, this isn't the story of a haunted videotape. The film played out itself perfectly normally. As if possible, Dorothy didn't turn to the camera and start screaming while blood pouring out of her eyes or anything stupid like that. And I'm not interested in telling you stupid stories like you've read 100 times before. I just want to tell you of how I felt when I watched the video and some strange things it reminded me about. It's a strange story, and I really wonder quite what the producer, Paul Malkasny, was thinking at the time. I know that the power behind the film didn't really rest with him. Instead, it rested with the film's director, Walter Murch, and the specialists in the sound and editing. Murch only worked on the editing for films like The Godfather and The Apocalypse. But Return to Oz was the only venture into directing. I kept thinking that something may have happened to him during the production of the film. Maybe there's something that was off-putting about directing any films from then onwards. But that it was just I had to take a guess. My mother got a copy of the film on VHS. I remember distantly because she always also had a copy of the old Judy Garland musical version. She loved that film. I was somewhat less impressed with it. The SIPA opening for the child who wanted to use for color television. It seemed boring to me. I didn't care for the dancing, and the witch didn't impress me. All the sets just looked too false. I found myself not appreciating the film. My mother, though, loved it. When I was an adult, she told me about Judy Garland's drug addiction and her gradual fall from Hollywood grace, a story that felt equally tragic to anything on the silver screen. Return to Oz, however, wasn't a sequel. In fact, the only thing connected to the musical version was the presence of the ruby slippers, which they were silver in the original book. But my mother was excited to see it, so she asked a friend to find her a copy of the film, and we watched it. The film tells a story about Dorothy's return to the land of Oz, or at least, it should have been wonderful, but really it isn't. But she's desperate to go back, and when we see her first met her in the film, she is very depressed, miserable, and lonely. The very first image we have of the film was staring sadly into a dirty mirror, and before long, her family start to take her to the hospital. At the hospital, which transpires more of an asylum, Dorothy is introduced to a doctor. Keen to try out any newly invented electric healing machine, the doctor introduced Dorothy to it, pointing out the machine's features. Here, he explains, pointing to the voltage meter, is its mouth, and here, he explains, pointing to the switch that send the cracking shocks of electricity searing through the young girl's skull, is his nose. She is escorted down to the bowels of the hospital, through tall and towering hallways, and locked within each barren, an empty cell. That night she is strapped into the hospital bed, and with it the screams of her inmates echo throughout the hospital, is secured to the electric machine. A storm rages outside, and soon it knocks out the hospital's power, during which Dorothy is rescued by another young girl. Together, they flee into the river and at the banks of the hospital, where they drowned. I mean, Dorothy returns to the land of Oz. She journeys there in the ruins of an old crate, floating down the river. That's the way the story goes, I guess. But that's not what it happens. In the old Wizard of Oz film, in the one with Judy Garland, Dorothy's house is plucked out of the farm by a hurricane. We all know that hurricanes don't move people from one location to another and drop them, gently and carefully, down in another. If she had been a real person, caught in a small wooden farmhouse in the winds of a hurricane, Dorothy would have died. And maybe she did, and the rest of the film was just simply a hallucination within her fevered and frantic brain. No, it's just a fury. But in this film, Dorothy, in Return to Oz, falls into a churning waters of the river, struggling to stay above its surface, her arms splashing and her mouth gasping forever. And then, she's in Oz. In a few more moments, everything seemed fine. Everything seemed quite happy. She finds a talking chicken called Bellina, who offers to travel with her on the way to Emerald City. Along the way, she finds a tree which distributes lunch boxes, filled with already made sandwiches. It's almost like anything may turn out alright once they get to Emerald City, because she'll be able to get back to her farm. Her farm, where she was sat staring into the dirty mirror, her eyes heavy with despair. David Kerr, about the Chicago Reader, described the film as bleak, creepy, and occasionally terrifying. You don't want Dorothy to go home, not to the world full of doctors who want to rip the happiness from her, from the nurses who tie her down from the towering hallways, and electric machines with wide grinning mouths. Down the river. Soon Dorothy finds her old farmhouse, which is the one that she had crashed in her previous visit to Oz. It sits on overgrown forest. No cheery or dancing munchkins can be found anywhere. Only wild vines and twisted trees. Dorothy wipes the dust that has itched its way over to the windows, trying to see inside. When she finds the yellow brick road, she realizes what has uprooted. Its bricks have been broken and shattered, and the land she wanted to get back to is twisted, nightmarish, and hostile. The old farmhouse I grew up in a small village in the rural areas of Cornwall. We had farms all around the landscape and could climb up one of those small, gently sloping hills and look out at the horizon to see only the fields of wheat for as far as it went. That was my Kansas. I think it was late last summer when I found the old farmhouse. I'd gone out to explore, despite my father's instruction to stay in our house garden. I hiked my way over the old crumbling stone wall that bordered our garden and made our way to the fields, venturing as far as I could before the sun would set. I avoided the fields with the cows, great towering things, and the clouds above gradually began to grow dark and pretentious. I would further gone than I had before, keen to examine the small corpse of trees in the distance that I have never seen to being before. It was there, down near the foot of the hill. That was when I saw the old farmhouse for the first time. I hurried down the farmhouse and ran up the windows, where they were itched with dirt. I could barely see anything through them. I stood up on my tiptoes, trying to look into them, and they could only make out a brownish haze. I scrubbed the windows, and soon I was able to make out the inside of the house. It was a disarray, chairs tripped over and a table lying broken on the corner. I could only make out the doorway leading to another room, but whatever lay through there was out of sight. It wasn't like the same house. The layout was different, and the ruins inside were different. But in and of its own self, the house was almost in perfect fit. It was like my own version of Dorothy's ruined farmhouse, transported here and not far from my house. I wanted to go inside. I don't know why. Perhaps maybe simply because it was there, or perhaps I wanted to get further than Dorothy ever did in the film. I pried the window open, and under the house lies the witch is dead. I crawled inside. It felt warm, as if the air itself was hot. There was a soft hum in the air, which I soon realized that was coming from a few buzzing insects. It felt stuffy, as if the summer heat was magnified and made heavy where there were no lights, and if there were the lights would not come on. The room dyed a soft reddish brownish from the dust on the windows. I crept across the house, stands on top of the dead witch, which she rots beneath. Wooden floorboards, and sure enough, they creaked beneath me. I looked into the doorway to the other room and found it and led it to the kitchen. Several items lay in the sink, cutlery and sharp edges. I started to feel sick, but I didn't want to be here, and the air tasted wrong. There was a smell, something I have never smelt before, but I knew it was bad. I turned around to leave and wanted to run, but then I heard a heavy sound of the doorway, and I knew it was a footstep. The figure stood in the doorway, a man. The house was marked with death and sorrows from the which below was her body left broken. Stood blocking out of the sunlight. He wore a thick, heavy coat, the kind that farmers used in the area where they wear, but his beard was thick and moated with like wire wool. His hair hung in dense clumps as he stared at me with his eyes, sharp and brutal eyes, with utterly intense hatred. He towered above me, a small child about 6 years old, as a giant figure. He was holding something in his right hand. I couldn't see what, only that it was sharp and pointed was stained with mud. It had to be mud. The man opened his mouth and roared at me, his teeth crooked behind his mane-like beard, releasing every echo of the old broken house with its words, "Get out." I ran. I turned and ran out of the house, charging through the kitchen and pulling myself through the window and out onto the field. I didn't slow down for a second. I tripped and fell into the mud at the base of the window, but I didn't stop. I kept running. I didn't look back. I ran over the field and through the trees, and I was grasping for air and my legs hurt, but it didn't stop me from running until I got home. I didn't notice that the dark and that the sun had set, and that the dark night had covered the village. I slammed the door shut, blocking out the man and the broken farmhouse forever. My father came downstairs when he heard me slam the door and demanded me to know where I had been and what I had been doing. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to tell him, so I lied. He demanded to know more eagerly, telling me that it was late and he knew I was lying. When I eventually tell him, he marched me up to my bedroom and ordered me to lower my pants over my bed, where he removed his belt and thrashed my butt until I was screaming and crying. He made me promise on threat that if the same punishment being delivered again, that I could not sneak into people's houses again. I was still sore for most of the day, so I had no idea until years later as to why he'd grown angry with me. When I did find out in my teenage years, our family had moved away from the village and into a small house in a large city. The change had been so considerable, not that in our terms of the building, but because of the new lifestyle, it became impossible to avoid hearing upon the world around us, and I had no longer had my parents' continual presence to shelter me from the information that you could find on the newspapers or the internet. It was in the evening news where I had seen a photograph of the man at the old farmhouse. The reporter had explained that he died in a prison, serving his life sentence for murder of 4 young children, all aged between 4 and 9 years old. He had been arrested for a month after my dad had taken his belt to me and made me promise not to venture into strangers' houses again. In prison, he had taken his own life. The news didn't say how. I later learned that he had broken off the sharp edge of his toothbrush and swallowed it, slicing open his throat. He choked to death on his own blood. Dorothy continued her journey down the broken ruins of the Yellow Brick Road. So did I. When Dorothy arrived in Emerald City, she finds all of her friends, but they have been turned into stone. They stood around the ruins of Emerald City as their bodies are lifeless. The city is abandoned, with only their bodies left in stoic. The Emerald City is abysmal, but it is not occupied, as one of the most terrifying moments of the film, meet the living occupants of the city, tumbles into view, moving on 4 legs, and each leg consists of screeching rusty wheels. At first we see its face, as a black twisted mass of tissue and muscle, corrupted into a maniacal grimace. Its eyes were peering out with a cold, biting glare. Then it lifts its head up, revealing that its previous face was simply a false one. It was a true face hiding beneath. It laughs. "Come here," it rasps in guttural scream. It laughs and laughs. More of them appear. 3, 4, the whole gang. Dorothy freeze, as I could clutch my hands to my eyes, hoping to block them out just to make the nightmarish creatures go away. Dorothy finds a locked in the old chamber in Emerald City, and the manacle garden called TikTok, who offers to protect her from the wielded monsters. His creature of its own mechanical face, much like the old electric shock machine used back in the hospital in Kansas. But it is Dorothy's friend, and it fights off the Wheelers and discovers that the city has been taken over by an evil witch called Mombi. TikTok isn't terrifying. He's a friendly, amicable character. The same cannot be said for all of Dorothy's friends, but we'll get to that. First, we just need to talk about Mombi. I didn't recognize her as a child when I first watched the film, but Mombi was played by Jean Marsh, who also played the nurse that strapped Dorothy into her hospital bed at the start of the film, and who had chased Dorothy into the river to meet her fate. She was, and for 5 years, married to John Pertwee, and the actor who famously portrayed the 3rd incarnation of Doctor Who. And perhaps more relevant to the story, played the character of Wuzzo Grummage, a scarecrow who is brought to life. I mentioned the scarecrow because Dorothy's other companion is a prisoner of Mombi's. When Mombi traps Dorothy in her tower, the young girl from Kansas meets one of Mombi's failed experiments, Jack Pumpkinhead. Jack is a terrifying creature, taller than any adult actor in the film, with the stick-thin limbs which seem to go on forever. It stands unsteadily in long legs, wearing the tattered old discolored coat, its fingers ending with the long-reaching branches. Atop its neck sits a pumpkin in the place of the head. When the creature moves, it does so in sharp, sudden jerks, pulling its hands long as if they were alien parts of its body. Its voice is sickly sweet, provided by Brian Henson. Brian Henson was the son of the famous Jim Henson and is now a chairman of Jim Henson's company. His voice, certainly the softest part of otherwise terrifying creature. If you've seen The Nightmare Before Christmas, you may find some interesting similarities with the film's lead character, and at several points throughout the film, Jack's limbs will break and fall apart, having to be bound back into place with rope. Dorothy's only way to escape from Mombi's tower is to steal the powder of life, which the witch uses to bring the pumpkinhead creature to life. She stores the powder in a glass cabinet, along with her spare heads. Yes, Mombi has a collection of spare heads. She changes them to fit her mood. They sit on the cabinets, looking for all purposes to be asleep, but each head has very much alive. That night, when Dorothy attempts to steal the powder of life from the cabinet, she accidentally awakens one of the dismembered heads, and it snaps awake to a raspy voice that screamed the girl's name, "Dorothy Gale!" The other heads awake, and they want to scream. They scream and screamed and screamed. Their echoing voices cry woke the witch herself, who roses from her bed in a nightgown, following the spectator in space on her shoulders, where the head should utterly be vacant. A headless figure stumbling towards the young girl, arms outstretched, and all the while the head screamed in terrible illusion. We had been in the city for a year. I'd been enrolled to a new school, and as far as larger I was accustomed to, and some of the boys at the start of the year had been brutally mocking. I was labeled a farm boy and teased about being an outsider. Over the course of the next few months, though, they had forgotten about my difference, and soon I was simply one of the other school kids. I had seen him in the schoolyard, didn't really know his name, but he was a bright kid with a splash of sunlight blonde hair. I think he must have been about 11 years old, but much to my young eyes, he couldn't have been older than an infinite number of years. He was a big kid. As a big kid, I tried to avoid him. But because that his friends were loud and boisterous, he was the upper years of school. As a result, he didn't have to wear his uniform. None of the upper olds, but so did the big kid who wear whatever he wanted. Usually a white t-shirt and jeans, but I don't think he's ever spoken to me. I barely even noticed him, but because of what happened, I remembered him. It was summer. I was off of school. During the start of the summer holidays, it couldn't been more than a week since school had stopped. And when it was still a few more weeks before we were due to head way to the seaside to spend our holiday in the sun, it was already a nice enough day. The sun was warm and there was a cool wind was in the air. My mother had taken me to the city center earlier that day, as she wanted to pick up a few items from the large post office, where packages were sorted. I was feeling rather sour, as my mother's venture out to do daily shopping had interrupted my time for watching morning cartoons. Nevertheless, I had trudged along, and promised that if I behaved, we could rent out a film from the video rental store that evening. It had been a long time since we had rented out Return to Oz, and the film had faded from my memory. I was excited. I was keen to see what we could find in the dark in the little video rental store. My mother had already certain that she wanted to rent out the Judy Garland musical version of The Wizard of Oz and relieve her certain love for the classic. This was years before Blockbuster came into England, and the rental stores, they were all small little stores, owned by enterprising individuals looking to break into a new market. My mother parked the car just a few yards from the store, and we got out. The wind was starting to pick up, and it was starting to feel a little cold. I grabbed my coat from the back seat of my car and put it on. My mother looked over me and said, "I'm going to pop into the bakery for a moment." The bakery, I should mention, was on the street corner, 2 stores from the video rental shop, with a small barber shop between two. "Wait here," she indicated for the front door of the video store. I waited. I wasn't going to argue, and I certainly wasn't going to disobey. I promised that of watching a new film that evening was enough to assure that. I waited for what seemed like an age, but I'm sure there was no more than a minute when I heard the shouts from the other side of the street. I looked over. It was the big kid in his white t-shirt and jeans, his bright blonde hair shining especially light in the summer sun. He was on the bicycle, along with 3 other friends. I recognized all of them from school, but they sound like the big kid. I didn't know their names because they were shouting to each other, circling around on their bikes, doing some small tricks. One of the big kid's friends would make his bike hop back and forth. Another would swerve onto the wheel, landing up on the top of the pedals. The other road was quiet. After about a moment, the group moved onto the road, riding around the parked cars. It was a peaceful morning about 11 o'clock, and the boys were cheering. One of them made his bike up high on top of the pavement, spinning around the handlebars as he did so. Not a single other sound could broke the summer day. I watched the big kid and his friends doing their tricks for a moment, but then I turned around and looked at the window of the video rental store. The window was now full of posters. I was curious to see what films that they have advertising. I looked from one to another, barely seeing any of them. The sunlight dimmed with somewhat as a cloud pressed of some front of the sun. The next brush of light of wind felt a bit colder, so I wrapped around my arms around myself and waited for my mother, when I heard one of the big kid's friends cried out. The truck must have taken on the turn of the road too fast. I didn't see it turn, but when I heard a cry, I turned to look around, tearing down the road. It was a huge truck, massive, towering over ferocious. and its carriage smashed into one of the cars from the far side of the road. The boys on the street started to turn and run, panic in their steps. One dropped his bike and ran on his feet instead. The scream of the truck's brakes, suffocating their own screams.